a ton of CC. There's so much CC within this class and these essences. It's absolutely broken. When I read through this, you could pretty much put a knock-up on like every skill that they have. There's just going to be chain CC even more than we already see in the game, which is really unfortunate in my opinion. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking about a potential farm build for Blood Knight, and this is actually the build that I'm going to go for first when we get access to this next week. Now, I want to mention that I also plan on streaming a little bit before the release of Shadow Knight, just to kind of get people comfortable with the channel, knowing that it's there and so forth. I'll be on Twitch. I already have a Twitch channel set up. I'll leave that in the description below, and that's been out for some time. I just don't stream all that often, but I will be doing so with Blood Knight. That way people can see essences, see if the class looks like it's for them. I've also saved a ton of chests that I'm going to open a day of the release just to get access to as many legendary items as possible. Same with gold. I've been amassing gold for a little bit here just so that I can splurge on the antiquities vendor and try to get access to as many of these essences, show them off, and kind of tell people and inform them what I think is worth using and so forth. So talking about this build, before we get started, I do want to make mention that we don't know everything about these cooldowns. Now, for example, here with Swarm of Bats, there's the ability to reactivate this to redirect the skill. So I think that this cooldown here, the 2 that we're seeing, is the amount of time that you have to redirect them and not the actual cooldown for the ability, right? Because the ability lasts for 8 seconds, which we can see below that. So having a cooldown that's nearly not even half of that time doesn't quite make sense. So we don't have perfect view of everything, so some of this obviously may change. Some skills may not function the way that we kind of picture them or see them, as we've seen with other classes as well. But this is what I'm going to go for first, unless I see some giant red flags along the way. Now, I have to do this in a manner, and there's no real good way to do this setup, but what I'm going to potentially use for this build for the primary is going to be Shadow's Edge, and that's the primary that if you are not in range of the target, you'll actually kind of throw the lance out, okay? So that will give you the ability to kind of extend duration of kill streaks, tag mobs that might be running without repositioning yourself and chasing them, or a loot goblin or anything like that. On top of that, I'm planning on using Swarm of Bats, Whirling Strike, Umbral Lance, and Skewer, and we'll talk about these abilities as we go through the essences. So let's start with Swarm of Bats first, and we're going to be using a chest, pants, and shoulder for that. So let's go ahead and take a look at the chest first, and this is just going to increase our damage, okay? So it's just going to be to increase the Swarm of Bats damage. After that, we'll go to the pants, and for pants here on Swarm of Bats, we're actually just going to take this one here that also poisons the enemies, causing them to take continual damage for 3 seconds. I think that this build is going to work best with 2-piece Vithus and 4-piece Grace, and some of that will be seen once we can kind of get in and test, but I have an inclination that perhaps Whirling Strike might benefit from Grace as well, which will give your Swarm of Bats additional benefit because it's persistent damage, or should be, also this poison over time, and perhaps even 2-piece Banquet, 2-piece Grace might function as well. So we'll kind of learn more about this, and again, just kind of take this as somewhat loose info and something to kind of work towards and adjust if need be. Finally, in this shoulder slot, what I recommend here is actually going to be the Swarm of Bats shrouding you in a fog of blood mist. I think this is going to be the go-to. Now, if you're lower resonance, this might not be the best choice. You might want something else, perhaps like the one below it, or perhaps even just buffing something like Umbral Lance instead, which is also going to be in the build. But the reason I think this will be the best choice for a lot of players is because it's going to just increase your movement speed, allowing you to get to the next pack, making you untargetable, just kind of reducing the damage you're taking while farming, and also dealing damage to nearby enemies. Now, we've seen in some of the videos that I've shown from a high resonance perspective for skills like the Wizard's Lightning Nova that transforms you into that arcane ball, that you can just run through packs and kill them. I don't know if everybody's going to have the capability to do that, so definitely keep this one in mind. And I think the next one may be this Umbral Lance charge to increase this, because when we talk about Umbral Lance, we're going to transform that skill and make it do something different than it originally does. So we'll see why that kind of is a benefit later. Now, the next ability is going to be Whirling Strike. Now, Whirling Strike is kind of similar to Whirlwind, perhaps, except for you remain stationary and just kind of whirl your weapon around. So I believe, although this is not being called a channeled skill, it should hopefully be continual. And we're going to use a helmet in this slot. And what we're going to look for here is going to be the additional charge, okay? So we have an additional charge to Whirling Strike, and this already has more than one charge, and we can kind of deduce that from the picture up here, if I can find it. So we know Whirling Strike has charges, and we can tell that by not only the tooltip of the in the picture, but also in the description here, right? Maximum 2 charges. So this is going to give us a 3rd charge, and that's going to be really nice when we're farming, because we can basically use this at every pack we get to. I imagine we don't know the time to refresh a charge, but I'm thinking in lines with other classes in the game currently that by the time you use that 3rd charge, you probably will have 1 replenished, and then you're still going to have your swarm of bats, you're still going to have your skewer and so forth that you can cycle in. So I feel like you're always going to have this to use when needed, and that's going to be really nice to kind of complement this build and fill in those gaps. Now, on top of this, we're going to have Umbral Lance, and we're going to use the main hand and an offhand to buff this. Umbral Lance is going to transform, so rather than talking about what this does from a baseline, we're just going to talk about what these essences are going to do. First off, is going to increase our damage the further we are from the target, and this is going to be important because in the offhand, what we're going to use is causing our shadow spears to randomly fall from the sky within an area. Think of this like the falling sword essence for Crusaders that you can throw out and do continual damage in an area. That's super effective for tagging a pack that's out of reach for you when you're farming, or if you're strong enough, you can throw it into a pack and just have it kill it while you go towards the next pack in the route, and it's just really effective for farming. So this should be a go-to in my opinion, unless this just doesn't function the way that it's kind of described, or it's clunky or whatever the case may be, long cast time that really just kind of interrupts the pace of your farming and so forth. Other than that, I think this is definitely going to be a combo that's utilized in farming for a lot of builds. Now for Skewer, we're going to use a main hand offhand combo again, and what I'm thinking here is probably going to be the Skewer essence on the main hand that's going to cause you to leap into the air and slam into a target location, knocking enemies up and stunning them. Now for farming, we don't care too much about the knock up or stun. However, what I like about this is the leap. As long as this is not super clunky, if it functions at the least like Daring Swing for Demon Hunters, or even the Leap for Barbs, it's going to give you a little bit of mobility that you can use when your Swarm of Bats is on cooldown and just give you kind of an extra thing. The biggest thing I notice about this class, or 2 biggest things I should say, one is the class kind of lacks mobility unless it's transforming itself into one of these mists or blood forms and so forth, and we don't really seem to want to use these in the farming situation. I think that a lot of these are going to get uses in PvP situations, but it doesn't seem like these are going to work their way into farming per se. Second thing I noticed about this class and the essences is there's a ton of CC. There's so much CC within this class and these essences. It's absolutely broken. When I read through this, you could pretty much put a knock-up on like every skill that they have. There's just going to be chain CC even more than we already see in the game, which is really unfortunate in my opinion. Nothing we can do about it other than just accept it at this point, or whatever it may be. But it's something we're definitely going to be dealing with from in PvP, but we don't need that knock-up effect so often in PvE, right? It's not a bad thing if we have it. CCing a PvE mob isn't bad, but often we don't need it, right? We're farming content that we have combat rating for. We're farming content that we kill quickly because we get more loot that way, more gold, more mats, whatever it may be. So it's not necessary. So you won't notice that when I'm describing the essences, but I want to mention that to you because I read through them all, and the number of CC essences is enormous. So Skewer, we're using this leap to get to the location faster, and then in the offhand slot, we're buffing not necessarily Skewer itself, but our character. So we're going to increase our damage by 10% for 4 seconds. And this will also open the option potentially for the Gloom set, right? You could use this as a dash skill, which it should hopefully be once it's transformed. And you could use that set to kind of buff your damage, buff your critical hit chance. So I think there's some diversity here with sets that you have. This farm build should function for a lot of the potential sets out there, and you may have some of these already, and I don't think it's going to be an enormous difference what you farm with. Now, if you're min-maxing for, say, raid performance or PvP, then that may be different, but I think you're going to have flexibility here. And honestly, Isatar is not a terrible choice for this loadout either, because, like I said, it kind of lacks a little bit of mobility, and having that Isatar set or potentially Massacre for a Paragon tree is going to be beneficial for this class that is basically running everywhere for the most part, right? Other than that Swarm of Bats to increase our movement speed, we're kind of just walking or running, so it's going to function similar to a Crusader without horse, and that's going to feel kind of bad, or a lot of what people used to farm with Necro as, if you remember that, where people weren't using the teleport dash, or before that existed, or they didn't have Wraithform on the build because they played full summons and bone armor, and farming, they were just always the one furthest behind the group, and we still see this sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying if you want to kind of keep pace with the pack, or you want to be an efficient farmer, we have to find a way to make the character move and so forth. So I think those are going to be the best choices. It's certainly going to be what I go for. Now, the Shadow's Edge for the primary attack, we're not using anything to buff that skill at this point. And again, we'll see how all this plays out, but I hope that this kind of gives you an idea of what you may look for. And like I said, tune into the Twitch streams next week, or potentially even before, and kind of talk about this or any other class that you may like. But I'll definitely be showing everything that I find and going through the essences, trying things that I don't even think make sense, but just trying essences out to see how they work, recording a lot, and kind of just getting information and video out as much as I can for everybody. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch, and have a great day.